having started your career at NAVA?
NASA.
And continue with NAVA.
Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing? So in previous presentations, I've talked about the use of flags in the U.S. human spaceflight program. Today, I'm going to talk about the International Space Station and flag use there. A note about terminology: astronaut is the generic term for space travelers in English. In Russian, however, it's cosmonaut, which is based on the Russian kosmonauт, and that's often used for people who fly on Russian or Soviet spacecraft, regardless of their nationality. So just in case the terminology gets confusing. Today, we're not going to be talking about Chinese astronauts or taikonauts because they're not involved in the International Space Station program. So it'll be astronaut or cosmonaut, either way. All right. So I want to get that all clear. So first, it's important to know a little history about international cooperation in human spaceflight. The first space mission involving crews from 2 different countries was the Apollo-Soyuz mission in July 1975. During the mission, an American Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft using a special docking module. The mission was meant to test how spacecraft from different countries could dock in orbit for crew rescues or as part of future international missions. Of course, there were flags carried into space as part of this mission. Above, you'll see one of 10 flag sets that were flown as souvenirs on this mission. These 2 are in the collection of the U.S. National Air and Space Museum in D.C. After Apollo-Soyuz, the Soviet Union focused their program on operating a series of space stations in Earth orbit. As part of that effort, they created a program called Interkosmos, and it was originally meant to fly representatives of countries that were allied with the USSR. So this would be socialist nations, was who they were intending to fly. These 18 crew emblems represent those missions in order. However, notice that the last 5 in the series involved France, Austria, the UK, and Japan. This is because these missions occurred during the era of perestroika and glasnost, when the Soviet Union was opening up, and they were also trying to get an influx of hard currency into the Soviet space program. So they were a dual-purpose propaganda and get some money out of the deal kind of missions. It took NASA much longer to fly astronauts from other countries. The increased crew capacity of the space shuttles and the frequency of flights made it much easier to fly larger crews. In all, astronauts from 16 different countries flew on 60 different shuttle missions. So these are just a few of the patches from those missions, the ones that had flags. And I wrote a paper a number of years ago on the symbology on these patches. So if you're interested in that, you might look that up. I'll give you a minute to look at this chart that shows how the evolution of the first 2 human spaceflight programs created opportunities for more countries to send astronauts into space. To date, citizens from over 41 countries have flown on government-funded missions, not counting dual citizenship. 3 countries have space programs capable of launching humans into space: Russia, the United States, and China. And there are now 4 companies that offer commercial space flights for people, but they're not counted in this chart. This is basically just the 2 governmental programs. Now we'll shift our attention to the International Space Station program. It's a partnership between 5 different space agencies: the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, Russia's State Space Corporation, or Roscosmos, the European Space Agency, which is usually called ESA in English, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, or JAXA, because it's space stuff and we have to use acronyms, and the Canadian Space Agency. Note that only 11 of the 23 ESA member states participate in the ISS program. Also, Brazil was a partner in the program early on, but then later withdrew in 2007. So there's a lot of countries involved. Phase 1 of the ISS program had 2 purposes. One was to test the interoperability of the US and Russian space programs. The second was to inject money into the Russian program to keep it going through the most turbulent part of the post-Soviet era. During the Shuttle Mir program, Russian cosmonauts flew on space shuttles. One American astronaut launched on a Soyuz flight, and NASA practiced docking the space shuttles to a space station. And there were also 7 American astronauts that gained long-term duration flight experience aboard Mir. So a number of different experiences were gained from this program. Russians and Americans learned to train each other's astronauts and also practice working together to manage space operations. Finally, this is the flag of the Shuttle Mir program, which basically is just the Shuttle Mir patch on sort of an strangely formed tricolor. While some elements of the International Space Station were launched by the Russians from Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the primary vehicles used to carry equipment and people into orbit during the construction phase were American space shuttles. There were 3 different shuttles used: Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Each of them had its own flag, of course, and this was part of what was originally the Manned Flight Awareness Program and later became named the Human Spaceflight or Spaceflight Awareness Program. And then I've also seen versions where, fortunately, they leave the logo off completely. So there's usually 3 different versions of these flags that you could find. There's not actually an official flag for the International Space Station program. My friends at NASA are very adamant about this because they work in public affairs, and they will just say there are no official flags. But there are 5 different flags that I found that have been used by NASA for ISS operations. The top 2 designs have the 2 program emblems that have been used during the program. And I know that at least there have been small 4x6-inch versions of at least 4 of these that have been flown on missions as souvenirs. A flag similar to the design at top right has been flown on the flagpoles at NASA's Johnson Space Flight Center in Texas. And the design at bottom center was flown at NASA's Glenn Research Center in Ohio. And also that 20th anniversary flag there has been seen inside the actual space station. So I've seen photos of it in orbit. This is quite an image here. The agreement that governs the International Space Station states that the different parts are owned by the agencies that contributed them. Notice on the diagram that the Russian hardware is clustered on one end, and that of the European and Japanese agencies are integrated on the opposite side. So this is just sort of how the thing came together as they started developing it. Flags have long been used as national identifiers on human spacecraft, so it should be no surprise that we see that on ISS hardware. There's one module that has 2 flags, that of the US and Russia, and this is because it was built in Russia, but it was paid for by the United States. For the most part, they use their national flags. So here's a US module and a Russian module as identifiers. And then these are the Japanese contribution and the Canadian arm. So those also have flags on them. ESA, however, hasn't used flags because since only a portion of the countries are participating, they've just used their ESA logo, and I think that makes it simpler. All right, let's get on to transport vehicles. And I won't go into these in great detail, but again, national flags used as national identifiers. The Boeing Starliner has been a little schizophrenic. That flag is moving around. I'm not sure they've decided where it's going to go yet. So you'll see that in various locations. All right, let's move on to spacesuits. Flags are also used as national identifiers on spacesuits worn by the crews. And the type of suit that an astronaut wears during launch and reentry is based on the vehicle type that they're flying in. So if you were in a shuttle, you wore one kind. If you were in a Soyuz, you wore a different kind. It didn't matter your nationality. So this became very important to have the national flag patches on those spacecraft to identify the nationality, since you couldn't tell by the spacesuit. All right. And then there's also the EVA suits used for extravehicular activities. So in the space station, there's two different airlock modules. There's a Russian one and an American one. And so if you go out the Russian module, the Russian air dock, you wear Russian suits. If you go out the American one, you wear American suits. But it's not just Russians and Americans that do spacewalks. So the astronauts bring their own flags to put on the spacesuit with Velcro. All right, I should probably pause. This is something I think is really interesting about the space station program, because there's two uses of the word crew. There's the crew that launches together up into space, and then there's the crew that's resident on the space station at the same time. And then sometimes different groups will go down together as well. So sometimes two guys will come up and then a woman will join them to go back down that didn't come up with them because somebody that came up with them stayed. So it gets very confusing when you read the word crew in this program. But this is kind of a cool thing from the space program, the space station program, is a lot of crews, they design their own little space flight suits that they wear, just everyday wear. And a lot of them have done these flag themed flight suits. So this is unique. That didn't really happen before the ISS. Sometimes the flag flight suits, though, have been a bit controversial. So I'm going to show you a couple examples. This is Anousheh Ansari. She's an Iranian-American entrepreneur who paid for a visit to the ISS through the Spaceflight Participant Program. In other words, they pay the Russians to launch them and bring them back down, and then they stay on the station for just a few days. Anyway, she wanted to have both an Iranian flag patch and a U.S. flag patch, but they wouldn't let her. She could only have a U.S. flag patch because that's where she was resident. But she did get to design her own flight suit and personal mission patch. So what she did is she used a neutral version of the Iranian flag for her patch. These guys are troublemakers. All right. This is a Russian crew that arrived right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so there was a lot of speculation that they maybe were making a political statement with their flight suit colors, because obviously there's a lot of yellow and a lot of blue there. However, they pointed out, there's a couple good quotes here. One of them said, well, when it came time to pick our color, there was a lot of yellow cloth, so we had to use yellow cloth. Then the official, I like this, sometimes yellow is just yellow, from Roscosmos. And then the best one was, and I think this is the most likely explanation, they all went to the same university. That is the coat of arms of the university, which is very heavy and yellow and blue. So I think that probably is the more likely explanation, but you know how that goes. Expedition patches, just like with other space programs, each expedition, this is the crew that's resident at the same time, have these expedition patches. And so a number of them have incorporated flag symbology. They might use a full flag, they might use pseudo flags, they might use just flag elements, but they're obviously meant to convey the idea of the nationalities of the people resident. Likewise, the launch crews have their own patches. So these are some Soyuz crew patches. And these very clearly match, if you've read my article on the shuttle patches, these very much match that kind of design strategy. Moving on, those patches have now led to the design of crew flags. This is a very new thing for the Russian program. And so they do a little ritualistic raising of their crew flag when they're in Baikonur. And then the prime crew, this would be the actual crew that's going to fly, not the backup crew, sign the flag and leave it for the museum in Baikonur. So that's a tradition. And I know that small versions of these flags have flown also as souvenirs. Here's some more pictures of the different crew flags. So again, not very imaginative, but for them, they're very significant. All right, flag displays. There are flags all over the place in the International Space Station. You go in, look at any particular mission, you're going to find something with a flag in it. So it's not very challenging to find the pictures. But they do tend to, see bottom center, that's the European module with a French astronaut. So they do change out the flags often to reflect the nationalities of whoever's on board at that time. We're going to talk about this one at upper left, that US flag, shortly. The international flag displays are often meant to show international cooperation. So this is all the participant countries at the time that picture was taken. The wad of flags over there they use that a lot during the Olympics when they do silly little Olympic events up on the space station. So that's a common one that you'll see during things like the Olympics when there's a lot of international spirit going on. Astronauts like to pose with their national flags. So here's some great examples of that. And one of their favorite spots is in the cupola, which is this really cool window module that gets great views of the Earth behind them. So we have also some Marine Corps. Obviously, a proud Marine was up there for that picture at bottom right, because those are all Marine Corps flags. There's some rarely flown flags that have been seen up on the International Space Station. This one down at lower right for you, sorry. That is a biker group from Russia called the Night Wolves. I found that one really interesting, but they're also very nationalistic, and Putin, I think, is very fond of the Night Wolves. So that might explain how their flag ended up there. Okay, this is a kind of cool story. This is a flag that was taken up on the last shuttle mission and left there. And they made a challenge. They stuck it on this hatch. And the challenge was whichever commercial spacecraft got there first, that crew got to bring the flag back down. So it was SpaceX that managed to achieve that in 2020. They retrieved the flag and returned it to Earth. Kind of cool. It's scheduled to go on the next US mission to orbit the moon. So this flag is not done. It's going to get a lot of flight hours. We have extravehicular flag displays by the Russians, really. They're the ones that like to do this. So the national flag, not too controversial, but the Soviet banner of victory, that was a bit of a controversial one. And especially because that was also after the invasion of Ukraine. So they did that on Victory Day. So from a Russian civil religious point of view, it makes sense. But of course, NASA wasn't particularly thrilled. Okay, one more controversy. Our friends that had the Ukrainian color flight suits, I think in order to prove their loyalty, later posed with the flags of 2 regions of Ukraine that were occupied and later annexed. So we've got Luhansk and Donetsk, their flags on the space station. NASA was not pleased and strongly rebuked Russia. So that's kind of how politics works in space. When a flag is flown as a souvenir on the space program, if it's flown on the US program side, it's typically mounted on a certificate. These are almost always presented to somebody who worked on the program. But when they fly on the Russian side, they get canceled with postal cancellations that are kept on board. So they basically say like on board the International Space Station in Russian. And even astronauts from the European countries and Japan, they also use those. So NASA has announced the planned retirement of the International Space Station in 2031. They're going to disassemble it and steer it into a controlled reentry into the South Pacific. So an uninhabited part of the South Pacific. So I think French Polynesia will be okay. Anyway, so we could be confident that this isn't the end of flags flying in space. Also, the Chinese have their own robust space program. The Russians are planning to build a new space station, and the US and their allies are planning to go back to the moon and Mars. So we'll have to see what flags are taken to those locations in the future. Thank you.
want to ask about to as a wad of flags.
The wad of flags.
So a wad or a collection of flags that they keep there. Is that
It's basically, the decorative flag string, and it's very long. And when you're in zero gravity, they do what they want to do. So it basically, every time you see a picture of that, it is a wad because it's just flags floating around connected by a string. So yeah, they have the whole place is full of little storage compartments, and there's a lot of propaganda stuff they keep up there for various, I'm sure there's an American flag always kept someplace in the US module where they can pull it out when they want it. The Russians have all sorts of stuff on their wall. The Japanese do, the Europeans do. So yeah, these things just end up going up on a flight, and then they usually stay up there. So it's getting a bit full, I think, probably by now. Back here, Jim?
Yeah, as you may recall, after Apollo 1 fire, NASA became hyper attenuated to fireproofing in space, and all the flags that went on the Apollo mission had fireproof. The same protocols apply at the International Space Station.
No, I don't think, and Jim, I'm not sure about the fireproofing for all of the flown flags. There's a difference between stuff that's flown in the crew module and stuff that was flown in the lunar module, because in the lunar module, it was away from the crew. So a lot of those flag kits from the later Apollos were down in the lunar module in a storage compartment. So I'm not sure that all the Apollo ones were fireproof, but they really don't worry about it now. Yeah, they just use standard, purchase, I think by Annan, but don't quote me on that. Small 4x6-inch flags, and that's what gets flown.
The crew that was in the yellow, did they have to launch up the Donetsk flag, or did they already have Donetsk?
Okay, so my theory, I don't know exactly when those two flags went up. I suspect it was later on a supply mission. So not everything flies up with the crew. They also have these Progress. It's basically like a Soyuz, but it doesn't have people in it. And they pack it full of stuff. And then when they unpack all the supplies, the food, new fresh clothes, all sorts of stuff, then they put all their trash in it and send it back down. So we're talking, just imagine what kind of stuff dirty clothes, whatever, gets shoved in that thing and they send it back down. So my theory is after that whole furor over the yellow and blue uniforms, somebody decided, you know what, we've got to send these two flags up and get a flag photo with them. Now they may have had that banner of victory with them because they knew they would be up there on Victory Day. And so that flag is everywhere, at least in Russia now during Victory Day. I mean, it's a standard part of those celebrations. So that one I suspect they took with them intentionally, but I bet those other two came up on a Progress. But I can't prove it. So, yeah.
Has there ever been a proposal to literally put a flagpole on the outside of the station and fly a flag?
Well, here's the deal. It's important. Safety and the security of the structure is more important than the propaganda, no matter how much we love the flags. So the exterior, no, I don't think they would ever do that because it's just another thing there that could get in the way of something. So no, I don't think they'll ever do that. However, when they go back to the moon, when they actually have a landing, I'm sure they're going to have more flags placed on the surface, but they'll probably represent multiple countries this time. And I'm sure when they go to Mars, they will again have multiple flagpoles because probably for all of these missions, there will be international crews.
Quick point and a question. The point is that Earth flag in the lower left was designed by Oscar Pennefeld, who is a NAVA member.
Mm-hmm.
And question, I was thinking when you showed the extra vehicular flags, if they ever lost one, What would happen? Would it just sort of float along next to the space station?
You know, it probably would, but then eventually I think it would, because the space station has to be it doesn't, I'm not a physicist. I don't do orbital mechanics. I'm a librarian. But you have to, when you have something that's in orbit that long, my understanding is to maintain a stable orbit, you do have to do burns occasionally to keep the speed in the stable orbit. So at that point, if the flag is sort of floating nearby, I think when you do your burn to maintain your momentum, then the flag's gonna fall behind. I think there have been objects that have been lost during EVAs, but I haven't studied that. So that would be a good topic for you.
I like the Canadian wind there.
That's not wind, that's the flagpole design, Ted. All right, anybody else? Pete, last question.
So in touching on the parent-belt flag, you also flag wants to use national flag in Platoff. Has there been any serious thought about basically using some kind of flag comprehending all nations rather than just this big clutter?
Okay, I very much doubt it, and here's why. I mean, I think it goes back to the whole thing with the Apollo flags, where at first there was discussion about putting a UN flag on the surface, but once members of Congress heard this, they got all pissed off and said, not if we're paying for it. So I think it'll be flags that represent countries that are paying for it. So just my thought. I don't represent NASA, so I can't say for sure, but judging from how things generally work at NASA, I'm probably going to be right. All right, thank you.